Okay, let's dive in. I want to focus, and I'm going to create a series of videos that deal directly with different aspects of viewport rendering, which will eventually lead to a larger discussion about rendering in general. And I'm going to try to break it down into components so that you can deal with each one and then collectively put it all together and use them as tools. Now, I'm going to maximize my windows. I'm also designed a layout that is more conducive to work in rendering than it is for modeling. And you should get used to creating different layouts and then going to your tools, toolbar layout, and doing a save as, and as you can see here, I have a tool list called AFS rendering, and you can save your different work environments so that you can load them up. And I suggest putting it on a USB drive and also saving it if you have Rhino at home in the appropriate directory within Rhino, and you can find out that information online. Okay, but now what I want to talk to you about is that I want to talk to you about your viewport rendering modes. And as with everything in Rhino, as we always say, there's at least 3 ways to do the same thing in Rhino with almost everything. And here we have view over here, and we have like our wireframe, shaded, rendered, ghosted, x-ray, technical, artistic, pen, and T-shiny, which are our viewport rendering modes. We can also click here, and we can go down here through our panel menu right here: wireframe, shaded, rendered, ghosted, x-ray, technical, artistic, pen, T-shiny, and so on. Okay. We can also go into our display menu, and I've docked my display menu down here, and we have our display, which is wireframe, shaded, rendered, ghosted, x-ray, technical, pen, artistic, and so on. But the most important menu down here is this one right here, which is capture viewport to file, that's actually your camera that allows you to take pictures of your viewport. And I'm going to select that so that you can also see it as a command, which is view capture to file. And I think version 6 has a different name for it and possibly more options, but that allows you to output your viewport. Before we get started, another critical thing, when we go into our render settings, and I want to remind you of this, that you want to make sure that transparent background is selected, because that allows you to output your output from not only your renderer in this case, but also your viewport renderer. You can output them to files that have transparent background, which is good for masking. Now, my favorite way, and the way that you should become familiar and operate with the viewport menu, is through this method right here. You click on here to make this active, and I want you to come through the display right here. I want you to come through the display because this is the nerve center of it. I'm going to move this window down just a little bit so that we have everything open so that we can see like the whole measure of this menu. And right here, it has the active viewport, and it has the viewport name located here. And what I want to go through, and what we will go through, is that we're going to go through each one of these viewports, and more importantly, we're going to look at the settings for each one of these, because this is where, these are all parameters, and this is where you can begin to manipulate these parameters to create more artistic interpretations for what I want to call viewport render passes. And I want you to think of it in terms of creating render passes that you can then composite within Photoshop to create your own original artistic styling for your display in Rhino. And this is the introduction to this, and as we move forward, we're going to go through this in more detail. And what I'm going to do first is just an overview of the different viewports so that you can become more familiar with this really wonderful and dynamic tool from within Rhino. Now, it seems that we always have to take a step back in order to take a step forward. And before I dive into the viewport display modes, I want to talk about organizing and following, like I'd like to call the good enough rule, which is named after Ashley Goodenough. And that is that you always design your layers and color your layers in the manner that you want your final render to be. And this will become really important. And layer organization, as we understand, is really important for KeyShot, and it's going to become really important when we start getting into rendering with Rhino. And it's equally important as we consider the viewport render mode. So make sure that your layers are organized in a coherent manner that illuminates the visual aspects of your model, and I'm going to describe it that way. And during this lecture, I'm going to be moving between this model and the flat fab model to show you how the techniques are applied to different things and how it looks on different types of geometry. The other geometry is more flat and planar. This one is a lot more volumetric and free-flowing. So let's hit it. So as I stated before, we want to go through the display menu, and we want to work with the display menu. And here in the display menu, we have the active viewport and we have the display mode. Now I can access these here, but I'm going to focus during this part of the lecture on doing my work from the display menu, because my goal is to illuminate what is visible when you combine a display with different aspects of object properties. But I'm going to focus on the display in this one. Now, the first window is I'm going to go up here, and I'm going to go up to wireframe. And here we can see when we switch to wireframes, we have display mode, then we have our general settings. One of our basic general settings that apply to almost all of our menus is going to be our, we have solid color, which this is, and we can set the color. And if we wanted to change the color to white, we could change the color to white, which gets rid of all of our model. Let's go the other direction. Let's go with like a black, and it shows the model in that way. And that might be good and interesting in this case for masking that if you wanted to do that. And so you could sort of use like a black like that, or even better yet, you could go with like a green or a blue, and that would set up a masking layer for some of your renderings. And that's a quick way to create a mask. You could go with a green or a blue, and that would give you a color key that you could use to mask out your elements. And you could work that way and know that you've sort of embedded a mask into your design. So that's why that's important. So I'm going to change this back to 50% gray. I like the darker gray, actually, like that. And we can render with that, okay? And so that gives you a sense of the color. So we can also go here and get like a 50% gray, which would be somewhere in the middle, right over here. RGB, it would be 128, 128, 128. Normally we use that for a lot of our rendering in Photoshop, and that's a way to create a 50% gray background that we use, the standard that we use for a lot of our work. But also note, again, as I said, that you can use your backgrounds to create green screens for your animated, for your work. But we can have something like that and have a 50% gray backgrounds. Now, a lot of these are common. If you're using surfaces, you can control the isoparm display on your surfaces and get rid of that so that you can turn your isoparms on and off. You can turn your edges. Now, lots of edges right there, right? Because it's wireframe, right? And here we turn the isoparms on and the edges off, and we get that kind of display You can, for mesh, you can turn off and on your mesh wires. You can turn on your curves, and I'm going to go through some of the common tools. If you have curves in your scene, you can turn your curves on and off, and that'll be good. That becomes useful for when you have curve elements that you want to include in the composition. You can turn your lights on and off. You're not going to really see the effects of this in wireframe modes, but in some of the other modes that becomes important. Your clipping planes, also text, annotations, points, and point clouds. So note that you can include some of those elements into your work. So now let's go from wireframe and let's go to shaded. And so here in shaded mode, you can do regular shading, and also you can turn on flat shading, which gives you a more faceted version. I'm not sure what shade vertex colors is. I'm going to have to get a better understanding of what that is and dive a little deeper and find out how you activate the vertex colors. But I think you may need to have a polygonal geometry in order to do that. And normally with vertex colors is that you can have a color assigned to different vertices, and it'll create like a blend between those and create effects in that way. Now here we turn the shadows off, and here we can turn the shadows on, and that illuminates our models. Here we can turn the surface isoparms on and off, okay? We can turn the surface isoparms on and off. We can turn our edges, and I'm going to get rid of my surface isocurves, and I can turn my surface edges on and off. Now note that there are two differences. The edges describes the outer edges of geometries, and your isoparms define your the interior patches of your geometry. So here you see the interior patches, and the edges define the outer portions of your geometry. And here this would be your isoparm. So if I turn off my edges, you notice that it just reveals the interior isoparms with the object. So that helps you get an understanding of that and how you can manipulate settings such as that. This is not mesh, so there are no mesh wires. There are no curves in this design. And a lot of times you may have curves in your scene and you don't want those to be seen, so you can turn curves off to do that. If you have text in your scene, this is a way that you could make your text visible and have you could do your labeling within Rhino by using your text and annotations. If you wanted to include scale information using your bounding box, you might want to turn your annotation on and off. Now you can also set the level of transparency of your model. So if you made it 50% transparent, it makes it 50% transparent. So you could also use your transparency slider to do, so in this case you're almost making it wireframe, right? And let's see, 100, and if we go to the opposite realm, we go to 0. The object is solid once again. The object is solid once again. But note that in this mode, I have green and blue in here. If I want it, you can use a solid color to chroma key your design. So in this case, I have to look for a color that's not in there, so maybe I'll add a magenta, and then I could use the magenta color to pull a mask from this if I was trying to create a mask and they almost operate in the same way as a blue screen, but it would allow me to separate that from the background, which is what it is that you're trying to do. But let me get back to my 128, tab 128.8. And these are some of the common sort of settings for your rendering, and you have these things which you can manipulate. Now let's go in here and let's look at some of the other modes. So we looked at wireframe, we looked at shaded. Now let's just go through these and look at these. We look at rendered, and rendered gives you a rendered version of your geometry. But and I'm going to go through it and then I'm going to come back at it again. Ghosted gives you the ghosted version of your model. Note that the most important thing is that yes, you can control the transparency. So if you don't like the initial Rhino ghosting level, you can turn that to 10%. And you know that makes it more opaque. As you get to 0, that's like 100% opaque, and 75, that's the level of transparency. So you can use that to adjust the transparency of your design. And sometimes you can use this to create and to illuminate like interior aspects of your model when you composite it over something else. So I always want you, as you're working and looking at this, to see these in compositing terms and to look at it in compositing terms. So I'm going to go back to 50% here. And now we want to go here, that's ghosted, and we're going to look at X-ray, which is interesting mode here. It's supposed to be see-through. Your X-ray mode is supposed to be see-through, but you note that this is set to 0. So let's set that at 50%. And X-ray is a lot, and it's akin to ghosting. But notice that within here, you can play around and add some of those elements here. You can add the surface edges, and you notice that that creates a really wild kind of mess there. So you almost, you don't want to see curves or interior edges in that situation, and you can focus on other aspects of the model, like turning the shadows on and off, and also going in and playing around with, if you had some lights, it would bring up the lighting within the scene. But you can play around with these parameters. And here we go from X-ray, we go to technical. Technical gives you a drawing of your model. And I need some more power in my graphics card. This is telling me in a nice way. But you get this nice technical drawing of your model, which is a combination of edge colors and interior isoform. So here, as I look at this, you have hidden lines also, right? Which is nice. And so here I could bring in like the back facing side, turn that on and off, turn my edges on and off. So you have different parameters for this. You have your silhouettes. And the fun is going in and playing with these different parameters. And here, this shows the seams in here you have like your intersections and any lights that may be in the scene. I turned off all the lights, and these you're all familiar with. But you note that this turns in some different parameters, and you don't have the coloring here with that. Artistic is a variation on technical. And you have your shadows. It adds like shadowing from your renderer. It also has like hidden line where you can turn off and on the hidden lines in your design. So it shares those, and you can adjust the edges, which works really nice sometimes with the darkness right there. And here we'll go to pen. And this is sort of like a pen version of it. And it's important that here that we play around with our hidden lines right here. And this is a great, really, really wonderful way to get a wireframe. Here, if we use like our pen, we can get a really nice illustrated version of our model. And finally, we come down here to TS Preview, which makes shiny, puts specular colors on this, and we can turn that on and off. And the really nice thing is that when you think about the ways that you can composite these together in interesting ways, you can come up with some really interesting backgrounds. And once again, I'd almost look to composite that, and so now I could isolate that and pull that and separate it from its background and apply it to something else. That's the way I would use that, and go back there. And finally, we go to TS Shiny, which is another version of this. And here, shadows on and off. We can add isocurves to that. and add surface edges once again. See our surface edges, and it's not a mesh. The curves, lights, there are no lights. I turned off all our lights, and these are all elements that text and annotation and points are elements that we could add to the design to bring out those aspects of some objects. And there are a lot of really interesting things that we could do when we think about ways of combining all of these things together in interesting ways. And I hope that was a little long, but I hope that it provides a nice broad overview of the viewport display properties. And the trick is think of them as parameters. Think of it as ways of generating think of it as ways of generating render passes, and also think about the ways in which you can use these to bring out and describe aspects of your model, to bring out and to show and to illuminate different aspects of your model. And I'm going to stop it there because we ran a little long.